The first thing I noticed was how confident she sounded when the police cars pulled up. Not nervous, not relieved, confident. She was already explaining the situation to one of the officers, pointing in my direction, gesturing toward the lake like it was evidence. I stayed where I was, hands visible, calm, watching the scene unfold like it had already happened before. She kept saying the same phrase over and over again, that I didn't belong there, that I was violating HOA rules, that she had warned me. The officer nodded politely, not committing to anything yet, and then glanced at me. Before he could even ask a question, she cut in again, louder this time, explaining that the lake was private and restricted, and that she'd finally had enough. I remember thinking how certain she was, how absolute her tone sounded, like there was no possible version of this moment where she wasn't right. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was that she was standing on land she didn't own, arguing rules she didn't have the authority to enforce. The lake sat at the center of the neighborhood like a mirror, smooth and quiet most mornings, framed by trimmed grass and a narrow walking path that curved around it. When I bought the property years earlier, that lake was one of the main reasons. It wasn't flashy, but it was peaceful, and it came with land that most people didn't fully understand when they looked at a neighborhood map. Over time, houses went up around it, then fences, then signs. Eventually, an HOA formed, and like most people, I didn't think much of it at first. I wasn't involved. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't interfere. I used the lake occasionally, usually early, usually alone, and never caused any issues. For a long time, that worked just fine. Things changed when she moved in. I noticed her before I ever spoke to her. She always seemed to be watching, standing on her porch, walking the paths with purpose, clipboard sometimes in hand, phone always ready. People adjusted their behavior around her without realizing it. Conversations lowered when she passed. Small rule changes appeared on bulletin boards. Parking habits shifted. She carried herself like someone who believed order depended entirely on her involvement, and maybe, in her mind, it did. She introduced herself to neighbors as a representative of the HOA, even when no one had asked. She spoke in certainties. No, I think, no, I believe. Just statements. Just rules. Our first real interaction was brief. I was near the lake one afternoon, sitting on a bench I'd placed there years earlier, when she approached me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked if I lived in the neighborhood. I said yes. She asked which house was mine. I answered. Her smile faded just a bit. She told me the lake was restricted to HOA members only, and that I needed to leave. I told her calmly that I was allowed to be there. She corrected me, firmly, and said she'd make an exception this time, but not again. I remember thinking how strange it was that she assumed she had that power. After that, the encounters became more frequent. Every time I went near the lake, she appeared. Sometimes she would remind me of rules. Sometimes she would warn me about consequences. I asked her once to show me where those rules were written. She said she didn't have to. She said everyone knew. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just continued using the property the same way I always had. That seemed to bother her more than anything else. Then the notices started. At first they were generic, reminders about lake usage, parking guidelines, noise expectations. Then my name appeared, then my address. The language grew sharper. Phrases like final warning and non-compliance started showing up. I kept every letter. I photographed signs. I saved emails, not because I planned to use them, but because something about the way she was escalating felt deliberate, like she was building towards something. Neighbors started apologizing quietly. A few told me she'd done similar things to them, but never this intensely. Most of them just wanted to avoid conflict. I understood that. HOAs have a way of making people feel small, even when they're wrong. She thrived on that imbalance. Every time she spoke, it was with the confidence of someone who believed authority was something you could claim simply by repeating it enough times. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a weekend morning. I was near the lake again, early, quiet, doing nothing that could reasonably be called disruptive. She approached me fast this time, no greeting, no pretense. She told me I was trespassing. I asked her to clarify. She said the HOA controlled the lake. I asked her if she had documentation showing that. She told me she didn't need to show me anything. When I told her I wasn't leaving, her voice rose just enough for nearby walkers to hear. She said she'd warned me. She said I'd forced her hand. I watched her pull out her phone. She didn't hesitate. She stepped a few feet away, dialed, and started explaining the situation with rehearsed precision. She said a non-resident was refusing to leave private HOA property. She said I'd been warned multiple times. She said she felt unsafe. I stood there still, listening to her version of events take shape. When she hung up, she looked at me with something close to satisfaction. She told me the police were on their way and that I should prepare myself. I remember thinking how sure she was that this was the end of the story. When the police arrived, she met them halfway, already talking, already pointing. I waited. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Because this wasn't about arguing anymore. This was about facts. And facts have a way of changing conversations very quickly. That's when one of the officers turned to her and asked a simple question she wasn't expecting. The question caught her off guard. It wasn't accusatory or aggressive. It was simple, procedural, the kind of thing officers ask when they're trying to understand where authority actually comes from. She answered quickly anyway, talking over the officer before he could finish. She repeated that the HOA controlled the lake, that she had already explained everything, and that I was refusing to comply. The officer nodded, then asked again, this time more clearly, who owned the land the lake sat on. She hesitated just long enough for the confidence in her voice to soften, then said the HOA did. She said it like it was obvious, like there was no need to verify it. The officer turned to me and asked for my side. I kept it brief. I said I wasn't trespassing and that I had documentation showing I was allowed to be there. I didn't explain further. I didn't challenge her version directly. I just stated that the situation was being misunderstood. That seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. She interrupted again, saying I'd been playing games like this for months, that I'd ignored notices, that I was deliberately violating rules. One of the officers gently asked her to let me finish. That was the first time I saw something like disbelief cross her face. They asked for identification. I handed it over. They asked for hers. She complied, still talking, still explaining, still trying to steer the conversation back to enforcement instead of ownership. I could tell the officers were listening, but not the way she thought they were. They weren't validating her claims. They were sorting them. There's a difference, and people who rely on authority instead of facts rarely notice it until it's too late. While they checked our information, she paced a few steps away, phone in hand, clearly messaging someone. I recognized the behavior immediately. She was calling for backup, not from the police, but from the HOA. She wanted witnesses. She wanted pressure. Within minutes, a couple of neighbors had drifted closer, pretending to walk the path while watching everything unfold. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The tension was obvious. One officer came back and asked her to explain the HOA's jurisdiction over the lake. She launched into it, listing rules, mentioning dues, talking about community access. The officer let her talk for a while, then asked if the HOA had any recorded ownership or easement documents for the property. She said she didn't have them on her, but that they existed. She said she could get them. The officer nodded again and asked if she'd like to call someone who could provide that information. She made the call immediately. While she waited, the officer asked me if I had anything I wanted to add. I said I did, but that it would probably be easier if they looked it up themselves. I offered to provide documents if needed. That response shifted the tone slightly. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them asked me what kind of documents I meant. I told him deeds, surveys, records, things that show boundaries clearly. I could feel her attention snap back to the conversation as soon as I said it. She ended her call and came back over, saying someone from the HOA was on their way. She said they'd clear everything up. Her voice had regained some of its edge, but it wasn't quite as steady as before. She started repeating that she'd followed procedure, that she'd given warnings, that this was exactly why the HOA existed. The office. RS didn't respond to that. One of them asked if anyone else had claimed ownership of the lake. She said no. She said it had always been understood that the HOA controlled it. The word understood hung in the air longer than she probably intended. Time stretched in a way it always does, when people realize a situation isn't going the way they planned. A few more neighbors had stopped now, standing at a polite distance. No one spoke, no one needed to. The officers pulled up something on the computer in their vehicle and asked us to wait. She crossed her arms, clearly irritated by the pause. She said she'd done everything right. She said this shouldn't be taking so long. One of the officers told her they just needed to verify a few things. Verification is where confidence goes to die when it isn't backed by reality. She tried to fill the silence by talking again, this time about how difficult I'd been, how she'd tried to handle things internally, how she didn't want it to come to this. The officer listening nodded politely but didn't respond. The other officers stayed focused on the screen. I stayed quiet. I'd learned a long time ago that when facts are on your side, silence is usually the smartest option. Eventually, the officer looked up and asked me a question that shifted the balance of the entire interaction. He asked when I acquired the property. I told him the year. He asked if that included the land around the lake. I said yes. He asked if I had a copy of the deed available. I said I did. That was the moment her expression changed completely. Not anger, not indignation. Something closer to confusion, followed quickly by denial. She said that couldn't be right. She said the HOA had been collecting dues for years. She said she personally enforced the rules. She said she lived there. The officer didn't argue. He just asked her again if she had any documentation, showing the HOA owned the lake or the surrounding land. She said she'd never needed it before. The officer nodded and said that didn't mean it didn't matter. The HOA representative she'd called still hadn't arrived. The officers went back to their vehicle and continued reviewing records. The longer it took, the quieter she became. Her posture stiffened. She stopped pacing. She stopped talking. She stared at the lake like it was the problem, like it had betrayed her somehow by not aligning with the authority she believed she had over it. One of the neighbors finally spoke, softly, mostly to themselves. They said they'd always wondered who actually owned the lake. No one responded. The officer came back a few minutes later and asked both of us to step closer. He said they were still confirming details, but that things were not as straightforward as initially presented. He said there appeared to be a discrepancy between what the HOA claimed and what the records showed. She interrupted, saying there must be a mistake. She said records were often outdated. She said the HOA had been there for years. The officer replied calmly that recorded property ownership tends to be very clear, especially when it comes to land parcels. He asked her one more time if she had anything official to provide. She didn't answer right away. I handed the officer a copy of the deed. He took it without comment and walked back to the vehicle. She watched him go, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. The confidence she'd walked into the situation with was gone now, replaced by something brittle. She tried to say something, then stopped. The silence stretched again. The lake remained calm, unchanged, indifferent to the authority struggle happening around it. When the officer returned, he didn't address her first. He looked at me and nodded slightly, then turned to her. That was when he told her they needed to talk about what the records actually showed. The officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound dramatic. He simply explained what the records showed, step by step, the way people do when they're dealing with facts that don't leave much room for interpretation. According to the county records, the lake and the surrounding land weren't owned by the HOA. They never had been. The parcel had been recorded years before the HOA existed, and it hadn't changed hands since. He gestured slightly in my direction, not accusing, not theatrical, just indicating. The land belonged to me. For a moment she didn't react at all. She just stared at him, like she was waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where he corrected himself or added an exception. When that didn't happen, she shook her head and said there had to be some kind of mistake. She said the HOA maintained the lake. She said they collected dues. She said she enforced the rules. The officer listened, then said something that finally broke through the certainty she'd been clinging to. He told her maintenance and ownership weren't the same thing. He told her collecting dues didn't transfer property rights. He told her enforcement only mattered if there was actual authority behind it. She turned toward the lake, scanning the water, the path, the grass, like she was seeing it for the first time. She asked how that could be possible when her house faced the lake, when she'd lived there for years. The officer explained that proximity didn't determine ownership. Deeds did. Surveys did. Records did. He told her that, according to those records, her house, along with several others on that block, sat on land that was part of the same parcel I owned. Not rented, not leased, owned. That was when the neighbors reacted. Quietly at first, small movements. A few exchanged looks. One person stepped back, like they suddenly felt uncomfortable standing where they were. No one laughed. No one said anything dramatic. The realization spread slowly, the way uncomfortable truths usually do. She tried to interrupt again, but the officer continued, still calm, still professional. He explained that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the lake or the land surrounding it. Any rules they'd been enforcing there had no legal standing. Any notices, warnings, or threats tied to that land were unenforceable. She said she'd never been told that. She said no one had ever mentioned it. The officer said that didn't change the records. She asked what that meant for her. He said it meant she didn't have the authority to remove me from the property, and that calling the police under the assumption that I was trespassing was a misunderstanding. He paused, then added that continuing to do so now that the situation was clarified could create problems of its own. That was the first time she went quiet. The HOA representative she'd called finally arrived, breathless and confused, clearly expecting a very different scene. She started explaining what was happening, but the officer cut in and summarized it quickly. He handed over the deed copy I'd provided and told them to review it themselves. The representative skimmed it, frowned, then pulled out their phone and started making calls. Their confidence faded faster than hers had. They didn't argue. They didn't insist. They just looked uncomfortable. The officer asked if there had been any formal agreement, easement, or transfer of ownership involving the lake. The representative said not that they were aware of. They admitted the HOA had assumed control because it had always been treated as common space. The officer nodded and said assumptions weren't legally binding. He told them the matter was civil now, not criminal, and that they should consult their own counsel. They had questions about past enforcement. She tried to say something then, but whatever she had planned didn't come out the way she wanted. Her voice was tight, restrained, stripped of the authority she'd relied on for so long. She asked what she was supposed to do now. The officer told her that, for the moment, she should stop interfering and let the HOA sort out its internal issues. He told her the call was being documented as a misunderstanding and that no further action was needed. When the officers left, the space they'd occupied felt strangely open. The lake looked exactly the same as it always had, calm, indifferent, unchanged. The difference was entirely human. The HOA representative said they'd be in touch, though their tone suggested they weren't sure with whom or about what. They left shortly after, avoiding eye contact. The neighbors lingered a bit longer. A couple of them approached me quietly, apologizing for how things had gone, saying they hadn't known. I told them there was nothing to apologize for. Most people don't question authority until it fails them. They nodded, relieved, and drifted away. She was the last to leave. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at me. She just walked back toward her house, posture stiff, steps measured, like she was trying to hold on to some version of control she still believed existed. After that day, the notices stopped. The signs came down. The lake went back to being just a lake. The HOA sent out a vague message weeks later about jurisdictional clarification and updated enforcement boundaries. No one mentioned my name. No one needed to. The shift was obvious. She stopped patrolling, stopped confronting people. When we passed each other, she looked away. The authority she'd claimed so confidently had dissolved the moment it was tested against something real. I kept using the lake the same way I always had. Quietly, respectfully. Nothing changed for me, and that was the point. Ownership isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't announce itself with rules or threats. It exists whether people acknowledge it or not. What changed was the way people treated assumptions. Questions started getting asked. Documents started getting checked. The neighborhood felt lighter, less tense. She never called the police again. She never questioned my presence again. And the lake remained exactly where it had always been, calm and silent, reflecting whatever stood before it, authority, entitlement or reality, without caring which one people believed in.